The title of my talk today is Critical Food Literacy Through Multicultural Texts. And in a moment, I'm going to define those terms, critical food literacy and multicultural texts. But before I do that, I want to first introduce myself. And I want to do that by showing you this map, which where the blue dots indicate all the places I've lived in. And I wanted to start here because my international upbringing and cross-cultural experiences really shape the way I approach my work and also inform the type of issues I'm drawn to, both personally and as an educator. So to begin, I was born in LA to Japanese parents and then moved to Tokyo when I was 3, and then lived in Singapore for 3 years and then moved back to Tokyo. And then in my last year of high school, moved to Manila in the Philippines. And then went to Ohio to Oberlin College to do my undergrad there. Got my master's in education at Harvard. And then for 3 years, I worked at a nonprofit in Boston called Primary Source, where I was doing professional development for K-12 teachers in global education. Then I moved to California and received my PhD in education at UC Davis. And the work I'm about to tell you today is based on my work at Davis. And my dissertation really was at the intersection of food systems education, multicultural education, and social justice education. And then as Dr. Ahmed just briefly introduced to you all, I now work at VIA, which is a San Francisco-based nonprofit where I do international education, and specifically I work with medical students from East Asia and try to promote cross-cultural understanding. So that's a little bit about me. And again, the cross-cultural experiences and international background I have really shaped the way I do my work, including in food systems education. And this is a big reason for why I'm drawn to diverse perspectives and really highlighting stories that might not be represented as much. So with that, I want to now turn to the course that I taught and designed while I was at UC Davis that forms the foundation of what I'm about to share with you today. So the course that I taught and designed was titled Making Visible the People Behind Food, Labor in the Food System. So just to give you a little bit of context, I really wanted to design a course that delved into some of the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues embedded in the food system. And so I landed on the topic of food labor, and primarily because if we look at the people behind food, many of them tend to be people of color, women, and or undocumented. So I really wanted to highlight their stories in this course. And I focused on 5 major categories of food workers. So farm workers in food production, slaughterhouse workers in food processing, warehouse and distribution workers, retail workers, and food service workers. And the way in which I made visible these various food workers was through multicultural texts. So what do I mean by multicultural texts? Well, there are texts which can be anything from books and articles to TED Talks, movies, documentaries, poems, comic strips. Multicultural texts are texts that highlight diverse perspectives and stories that may be underrepresented or marginalized. And these are 2 of the texts that I used while I taught the course. You may be familiar with them. One is called The Color of Food, which features stories of people of color in food production. And then Food Chains is a documentary about farm workers, specifically in Immokalee, Florida. And so through these multicultural texts, I tried to make visible the various people behind food. And then the other term I wanted to define briefly before I delve into my presentation today is critical food literacy. What do I mean by that? I'm defining critical food literacy as the ability to examine one's own values as well as grapple with multiple perspectives that underlie the food system. the ability to understand the larger social political contexts that shape the food system, and then the ability to take action towards social justice in the food system and sustainability more broadly. I expand upon this notion further in a paper that I co-wrote with Diana Robinson, and I've linked, or I have the title of the paper here, so if you're interested, please feel free to take a look. But the bulk of today's presentation and the goal of it is to really illustrate to you the potential of multicultural texts in fostering critical food literacy. So the three main objectives of today's presentation are to first introduce to you a conceptual framework for fostering critical food literacy, and then to model the process of teaching with multicultural texts with virtual adaptations given our present circumstances. And this is where we'll spend most of our time today. And then lastly, I want to share with you a couple of things, some food for thought while engaging in this work of sustainable food systems education. But before that, I wanted to start with a quick icebreaker just so that I get to have a better sense of who's in the audience today. So the question I want to pose to you is, what are some sustainable food systems topics that you currently teach or want to teach? And the way that I'd like us to engage is through Padlet. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have used this, but essentially it's a virtual whiteboard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this link to you on the chat. And so let me just do that. So if you click there, you'll be taken to this page. And once it loads, you should see a plus sign at the bottom right-hand corner. So if you click there, you can start typing. So let's say, just as a demo, like that. So, okay, great. So if you can take a few minutes to just write in your topics, that would be great. So I see consumption politics, climate change, food sovereignty. This is an interesting array of topics. Well, thank you all for sharing. This is really interesting. So we have, there's some overlap in what I see. There's indigenous foodways, food justice, political ecology. So it really spans multiple disciplines, which is great to see. So this is great. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. Thank you all for sharing there. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is to show you a conceptual framework for critical food literacy. So I'm going to unpack this diagram a little bit. So if you focus on the rectangle here, this is the instructional context or the classroom. So within this context, within this classroom, students are bringing in prior knowledge, beliefs, values, or experiences with respect to the food system. And as instructors, we can provide multicultural texts, and as well as experiences like internships or other types of engagements with food system actors and locations. And so as students engage with those texts and with those food system actors and locations, they're making meaning based on their prior knowledge and beliefs and values. And so if we look at the multicultural texts, as they engage with those texts, some of those texts, depending on the students, might resonate with students' prior knowledge and experiences, while other texts might challenge their prior knowledge and beliefs, to the point where students might resist those texts. But in some cases, those texts might start to complicate or raise questions about or add nuance to their prior knowledge and beliefs and experiences. And the same can be said with any experiences they have in actual food system locations, and any interactions that they have, whether with farm workers or farmers or anybody who's in the food system. And so this process of meaning making and thinking and reflecting, that really constitutes the process of examining one's own biases and assumptions and grappling with different perspectives. And that's a critical aspect of critical food literacy. And through that process of examining one's biases and grappling with different perspectives, some students then may feel motivated or inspired to take action on the food system, and that's the arrows represented here. And that action can take different forms depending on the student. But for today, I want to focus on the highlighted blue box here, because the focus of today's talk is multicultural texts. But I do want to mention that the sort of hands-on experiential learning that can be done in actual food system locations and actors is also important in the context of fostering critical food literacy. So, so now I want to move on to actually modeling that process of like, how do you teach with multicultural texts? So I want to dive in right away and get you all involved. So this is a text that I actually did use with my students, and it's called What I Learned from 4 Years Working at McDonald's. And I'm gonna, or Dr. Ahmed will help me place you in breakout rooms. But before she does that, I just wanted to mention that I'm going to be sharing the link to the text and some sample discussions on the Zoom chat momentarily. And then what you're gonna do is read the text on your own. And then once everyone in your breakout room has finished reading, then you can have a short discussion. And here are some discussion questions. Of course, you're welcome to discuss whatever else you'd like. These are questions that I have posed to my own students when I taught the course. So examples include, how did the text make you feel? Why? What is a word, phrase, or line in the text that stood out to you? Why? What issues or questions does the text raise for you? And what's a connection you can make between this text and something you've experienced or read or heard about? So I'm going to, before you are placed in a breakout room, I'm going to share the link to you in the chat. Let me do that. Oops. Sorry. Let me go back. So what I just shared with you, this link in the chat, it should have 2 slides on it, one with a link to the text and one with the sample questions. So Dr. Ahmed, if you could place everyone in a breakout room. Basically, we will regroup in about 15 minutes, and then with about 1 minute remaining, we'll let you know. We'll give you an announcement to say that we'll be regrouping.
Lina, how many?
Yes.
So we have 17 participants. Should I do 3 breakout groups or 4? 3?
Maybe 4. Let's do 4. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Lina. You can join one of the breakout groups. So I moved you to one. I think you have to click on something.
Okay, let's see. I don't.
I can move you to. So you're supposed to be in breakout group 4, but you have to click on something. Do you not see anything?
I don't see anything.
Let's see. I'm going to. Maybe I make you not a host. Maybe that's part of it.
Okay. Yeah.
And the McDonald's text is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to use it for my class next week. I was like, oh, wow. Okay, so I am going to, let's see if I can breakout group 2. Let's see if I can move. I'm going to, yeah, I think maybe if I unco-host you and then.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, let's try. Do you see any options to move?
Let's see. I still don't see it popping up. It's okay if it's. I was just curious about how the.
Yeah, me too. So I don't know how
okay.
to go into it, but I did move you into. You are, yeah. You should. Maybe I just close this and try again. Let's see. I go to the breakout groups. If you do, you don't see anything for breakout group.
No.
Let's see. Yeah, so it says that you were assigned breakout group 2, first 3 and now 2, but you haven't joined.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, I see a invitation now.
Okay, and where
Great.
was the indication?
It just popped up as a
Okay, excellent.
yeah. Okay, great.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Okay.
I think there might be some, and you'll probably get to this, but there might be some patterns in the text to choose, like going after what we know are some black and white issues, and then bringing the nuance in. Like I think very few people have lots of people have opinions about McDonald's, so it's a great place to play on.
Yes.
So the food system, we have so many. So as instructors, it's like we have to think, probably not too hard, but like, what are our own assumptions about?
Exactly. Yeah.
And then let's play on those black and white issues, and then find that nuance.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll touch on that, like in terms of the importance of the instructors themselves examining their own assumptions as part in doing this work. Yeah, thank you. Great. So welcome back, everybody. I'm going to reshare my screen again. So please give me one moment. Okay.
I'm excited to hear the discussions that happen in the different rooms.
Yes, me too. So would anybody like to share with the whole group what you discussed? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to share.
I think my discussion partner Nancy is on a. She had to step away for a call. Oh no, are you back? You're back. Well, then I don't mean to speak for you. Just going to say we had a really interesting conversation about who belongs in what kind of job, and just some of those preconceived notions that the author of the article describes so well in her experience, but connecting it to some other things that that we've either heard from our students or thought about ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Would anybody else like to share?
This is Neeraja, and can I go ahead and share, and you can add what I missed?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about a couple of things. One was about reflecting on our own assumptions and our own predilection, and how we judge certain types of jobs, or whether it's a low-paid job or a high-paid job in McDonald's versus Starbucks. We also talked about how body shapes and body types are valued or associated with a certain type of value. And then there was also, I think Lisa was in our group, and she mentioned about the front end worker and the back end worker, the diversity of people who are represented in the front versus who is at the back, and the kind of skills that are carried, that are associated with the people versus actually what kind of skills these people have. There's a couple of things that stayed with me. Will you please continue and fill in what I missed?
No, I think that's great. It's just that the front end, what's visible and what's hidden, I think are great areas to that indicate our values, the values that we may not always recognize, or that we might not want to believe we actually hold. And so these types of examples put that mirror up pretty obviously, I think, and a great place for us to kind of jump in.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to share?
Yeah, I'll just add from my group, we touched on a lot of the similar themes, and one thing that came up was thinking about who is an essential worker, especially in the context of COVID, and thinking about a lot of the ways that the workers described in this article could describe many of the essential workers who are allowing our society to sustain right now. So just thought that was a connection that we made.
Great, yeah, thank you. Yes, it's particularly relevant now with essential workers, and all food workers are essential. So actually that's a good segue into another activity that I want to model with you all now. So I want to share with you a couple of different follow-up activities that you could do with any given multicultural text. One is a polling activity, and perhaps some of you have used Poll Everywhere as a platform, but essentially what I'm going to do is model this for you. So the following slides are going to display statements that you can strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with. And you'll be able to submit your response via text or online at this link, which I will share with you now on Zoom, on the chat. Let's see. Okay, so if you click there, you should be able to see. So you should be able to submit your response corresponding to the stance that represents your stance. So I'm going to give all of you a minute to submit. So the first one is all fast food workers should be paid a minimum of $15 an hour. Have you all had a chance to submit? Or is this working?
Yes.
Okay, so then I'm going to move to the next slide, next statement. Oops, let me see. Oops, okay. The next one, fast food restaurants should be required to provide paid sick and family leave to all employees. Okay, then I'm going to present the next one. Okay, the next statement is, it is the government's responsibility to provide health care benefits to all workers, including fast food workers. Okay, and then the last statement that I will present to you all is, consumers should only eat food from fast food places that offer healthcare benefits to all of their employees. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for participating. So I'm going to now go back to the slides and show you the results that came in. So let's see here. Okay, so for the first one, all fast food workers should be paid a minimum of $15 an hour. So it looks like most people strongly agreed or agree, but basically everybody agreed. And so with Poll Everywhere, it's You can make it anonymous so that you can just see, like, let's say if you're doing this with your students, like you can't identify who said what. So in this particular group, all of you agreed. It will be interesting to see what would happen with your particular group of students in this case. And then with the next one, fast food restaurants should be required to provide paid sick and family leave. Again, all of you agreed. It just differed on the strength of agreement. And then for the next one, so there's a little bit more variation here. Although most of you strongly agreed, a couple of you agreed and a couple of you disagreed. And in a moment, so with poll everywhere, you can't really have a debate. It just shows you the variation that is present in a particular group of people. And in a moment, I'm going to share with you an idea that you can do virtually to foster a debate. And then the last statement, consumers should only eat food from fast food places that offer healthcare benefits to all of their employees. So there's more variation here, which is interesting. The one thing I will note is that this particular activity this is a virtual adaptation of an in-person activity that I did when I was teaching the course. And the in-person activity I did is called Four Corners activity, which perhaps some of you may have done. But basically, what I do is present a given statement, and then I invite students to walk to the corner of the room that represents a particular stance. So each corner represents strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And so there's a visual representation of who's in which corner. And then at that point, there can be a debate. So I've done that, and that's interesting to see. And I taught the course 3 times, and so with each iteration, there's variation. So now what I want to do is show you or talk about a potential follow-up activity that to foster that debate, and with Kialo, which is an online platform for engaging in debate on any given topic or issue. So I'm not going to actually do this with you. I'll just show you how it looks like. For example, if the statement is all fast food workers should be paid a minimum of $15 an hour, students can submit evidence or arguments for or against by clicking on this plus sign. And then they can submit pros and cons for each sub-level, sub-evidence. And so at the end, you can have this network of arguments at different levels. And the nice thing about this is it's live, or it's collaborative. And so students can see one another submitting various pieces of evidence. And so that's one way to foster debate for any of the previous statements that I used in the poll. So then if you do that, if you use Kialo as a platform to foster debate, then a follow-up activity to that is to have a reflection on it. So since students can see each other submitting like the various pieces of evidence to support their stances, you could invite them to reflect and see like whether and how their original stances changed as a result of how their peers are responding. So that's an idea for having a debate about this. And then one more follow-up activity that I want to share with you today is doing mini interviews among students. And the goal here is to give the students an opportunity to actively listen to one another's ideas and perspectives. So the goal here is not to debate, and this is not to for the students to try to convince each other or change one another's minds. It's really active listening and trying to understand the different perspectives. Because depending on the group of students you have, there may be a diverse set of perspectives that students are bringing in. And so it's really an opportunity for students to grapple with diverse perspectives among themselves. And this is an activity that I did do with students when I taught the course. So just quickly, here's a protocol that I shared with the students to do the mini interview, where, basically, I first have students sort of reflect a little bit, so on their own. So I used to think or feel blank, but now I think feel blank. They could also do, I used to think feel blank, and I still think / feel blank. I knew that blank, but it was surprising to learn that blank. I didn't know that blank, and I want to know more about blank. So this is just to kind of like basically try to foster this conversation that they're going to have in a kind of very structured way. So once students complete these statements on their own, then they interview one another for about 5 minutes, so very short. And so the interviewer basically asks the interviewee to share one of the fill in the blank statements, and then a few follow-up questions, like what makes you say that? What do you mean when you say? So again, it's not meant to be a debate. It's meant for the interviewer to encourage the interviewee to explain what they're thinking, and then vice versa. And then after students finish interviewing each other, then you can invite them to reflect on the experience and share anything that they found interesting or surprising. That was a quick overview of some activities that can complement a given multicultural text that you can do with your students. But does anyone have any questions, comments, or reflections on any of these activities that we just did? And please feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to share.
Thank you so much, Lina. That was really terrific. I love all of the different modalities for fostering interactive dialogue, especially during these times of COVID. So a lot of these platforms are new to me, and I can imagine them not only useful in the classroom, but also in research. I do a lot of work with communities, and during these times, it's hard to, engage in person with communities, but I can imagine some of these tools will be really wonderful to have, like community advisory board meetings and stakeholder meetings where you can get diverse perspectives even during these times of COVID. So thank you so much. And I really, just a reflection, I really appreciated the sequence of your presentation and providing a little bit of theoretical framework, and then sort of having that guide a very experiential experience in understanding these very practical tools for fostering an empathy for multiculturalism in the classroom.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Would anybody else like to share any questions or comments?
Hi, yeah, I appreciated your presentation. Thanks. There's some really great ideas. Do you have any like stories of what your experience was using that Kialu site, like in terms of moderating, or was it productive or unproductive?
That's a great question. Full disclosure, I did not use that, and that was because I was trying to, given COVID, like I taught the course pre-COVID, so I was able to have that debate in person with students. So I only learned about Kiala myself very recently, so I can't actually answer that question that you posed, but I think it seems to have potential, and I think having debate over Zoom is not practical. So it's something to consider. So if you end up using Kialo, I'm curious to see how it goes. But
I did maybe like a decade or two ago, I used something similar for like an interfaith discussion group.
Okay.
And it was it went pretty civil. It wasn't a class cohort. It was just open to the public internet, So and it was relatively civil and productive. So maybe it would be similar. Yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to try that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's possible to keep it civil if you introduce this activity, like not maybe at the beginning, but after certain norms have been established and you know your students well, then I think it could work. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Any other questions or comments that people would like to share before I move on?
Sorry, just is the software free, or do you have to subscribe? And do all your students have to sign up with accounts, or can they come on with a URL?
Are you talking about Kialo or any of the things I shared with you just now?
Sorry, Kialo.
Kialo is free.
And the students don't have to have an account?
No.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. You shared a few multicultural texts, and I was wondering sort of your approach for identifying specific multicultural text, and if you have a strategy when you're approaching your course syllabus in terms of the diversity, like your plan for diversity in the types of multicultural text that you are including.
Thank you for that question. And I'm sorry, there's a big truck driving by right now. So if you have trouble hearing, I'm sorry. So that's a great question. I think there's so many texts out there and there's only limited time. So I think it does come down to like basically a diverse selection of texts, and both in terms of perspectives and what was I going to say? I think different modalities as well. So not just text-based, but also visual and auditory. And so basically diversity in many different ways. And also thinking about like the particular group of students that I would be working with. Of course, I would be making assumptions about what they know or what they like what their values are. So purposefully selecting a couple, like for example, I was telling Will earlier, but like the McDonald's text, that was a deliberate choice because I knew that the course that I taught was an elective. It was not a required course. So therefore, anybody who would take the course would take it because they have a previous interest in food, right? Like otherwise they're not required to take it. And so knowing that, and at UC Davis, there's a very substantial group of students interested in sustainable food systems. And I can safely assume that most of them are not pro McDonald's. And so I deliberately selected a text that would kind of make them pause a little bit, and also kind of tease out this distinction between like the McDonald's, the corporation, and the people who work in it. And I think students may have a tendency to kind of be critical of or even demonize McDonald's for their practices. And certainly I'm not endorsing any of that, but at the same time, there's a very real difference between that and then demonizing the people who work there. And just because you work at McDonald's, does that make you an evil person? No. So I think part of the selection really depends on the types of students you expect that might take the course. And I think it might be different if it's a required course versus an elective. So basically consideration of the students' backgrounds and interests, consideration of the different types of texts, consideration of the author. Like sometimes the text might be about the food workers, but not necessarily by the workers. So I try to balance both like about and selecting texts that are basically produced by and about the workers too. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I really appreciate your sort of reflecting on thinking about who the student body is. When we're teaching in sustainable food systems degree programs, there is sort of a self-selection, for students who are interested and supportive of sustainability. So there's a little bit of a bias against institutions or practices that aren't considered to foster sustainability based on various dimensions. And so I think sort of the inclusion of text when we're thinking about diversity, just thinking about texts that are, that get students to sort of think about their own biases. So I thought that was really great, because, I do tend to select a lot of texts that are celebrating sustainability. And so when I'm thinking about diversity, including something on like conventional agriculture and perhaps in a different light, is a diverse text, in my syllabus, because most of my texts are about like sustainable agricultural practices, or thinking about how we can foster food sovereignty, and so in food access in equitable ways. And so some of the diversity actually comes from inclusion of like conventional practices, but seeing some of their benefits.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And actually, full disclosure, even for this talk too, I chose that, I went with a McDonald's text because I had made assumptions about what the group might be, this particular group might be interested in, and selecting a text that might challenge assumptions too. So, but thank you for that question. So then I want to now move on to the last portion of my presentation today, which is to leave you with some food for thought for fostering critical food literacy. So one is instructors need to be comfortable with discomfort. And this is really coming from my own experience of teaching. And I think the fact that, I think when I first went into teaching this course, I did not expect to feel uncomfortable, which in retrospect, I should have expected to feel uncomfortable. But so it struck me by surprise when I found myself uncomfortable as I was teaching. So just to give you a few examples of uncomfortable or challenging questions that did come up for me and that could come up for you as you engage in this work is, one is, what can instructors do to invite students to recognize the partiality of their own knowledge and experiences without denying or rejecting their perspectives? So I think as instructors, we really do want to value the prior knowledge and experiences that each student brings. But at the same time, we want them to move beyond that and to recognize that their knowledge and experiences are incomplete, or that it's partial. So how can instructors strike that balance? And for now, I'm going to leave it as open-ended. I'm not going to try to address these questions now because they're really large questions and there's no right or wrong answers. But another question that came up for me is, under what circumstances is it appropriate for an instructor to silence particular students, especially those who voice what instructors perceive to be offensive or believe as reflecting a dominant ideology? While I was teaching the course, the food workers that I highlighted were people of color or undocumented or women. And so with the undocumented workers, the topic of immigration came up. And with my first cohort, and we had some heated discussions among the students that took my course about immigration and also about the American dream, that sort of idea. And so I found myself quite in the moment. When certain students said certain things, I found myself quite uncomfortable. I could feel my heart beating strongly, and I just wasn't exactly sure how to respond in the moment. So after the fact, I found myself reflecting, like, well, what could I have done? And another example of a question that came up for me is, at what point should educators, if ever, voice their discomfort with what students say? Where or what is the line? When, if at all, is it appropriate for instructors to disclose their own views on a given problem or issue? I mean, I think we all come into this work with, of course, with particular views and values and perspectives on certain issues. And so when is it appropriate to disclose that? And then the last thing I'll say is instructors need to be reflective and reflexive, and having critical friends can help. So first, what does it mean to be reflective and reflexive? Reflective is what you all most likely do after you teach, is, to consider what went well, what could have gone better in terms of student engagement and pedagogical strategies. What's more challenging and what's more time consuming, but also equally important, is to recognize how the instructor's biases and values shape their teaching practices and interpretations of what's going on in the classroom. And so, at the same time that we're trying to foster critical food literacy among our students, and part of that is encouraging them to be reflexive and to recognize their biases. So it's important for instructors to do the same. So having a critical friend. So what do I mean by critical friends? So critical friends are colleagues to observe one another teach and reflect together, share and raise questions about one another's observations and interpretations, share openly about and work through any feelings of discomfort or frustration, and brainstorm teaching strategies to try out. So I did have a critical friend as I was teaching the course. So this course that I taught was actually part of my dissertation. I did a teacher research study. So I basically researched my own students, essentially. And my critical friend was also doing her dissertation on basically teaching a class that she designed. And so we observed each other teach and we reflected together. And I didn't really fully appreciate the value of this until we were deep into the conversations that we had. And as I mentioned, as I taught this course, I found myself feeling uncomfortable at times. And so it's really great to have somebody to openly reflect on that and work through the discomfort and frustration. And basically, in a way, it was kind of like a safe space for me to be really open about how I was feeling. And then also just brainstorming teaching strategies. And so it provided this judgment-free space that I think instructors would really benefit from. Of course, it takes time to do this. My critical friend and we set aside time at the end of every week, in addition to actually observing each other teach in the moment. We also set aside time at the end of the week to reflect. And so, with the questions I posed earlier, the uncomfortable situations and things like those are really great questions to work through as well with a critical friend. So this brings me to the end of my presentation for today. But does anybody have any questions, comments, or reflections on anything I shared? And if you do, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Lina, I know a bunch of people had to hop off, but there's some really nice comments that were posted in the chat window, sort of in appreciation with your flow and the very interactive nature of your webinar. So lots of great resources. And yeah, I think in general, the comments seem to be very favorable of all the resources and you modeling those resources and how to implement them in the classroom.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I have a question, Lina.
Sure, yeah.
Did you, when you're planning a course, how often, because it seems like some of these texts, it's a habit of mind that we want to develop in our students, this approach. So would you have 4 or 5 or one per week in terms of how you'd structure it? Or this is the question, it always depends on what your course is, but yeah, just that idea of the frequency, or if you've noticed the a minimum number of times to do it so that the habit of mind starts sticking, versus I imagine just doing this once in the course might not, students might not be as familiar. Yes, kind of around that idea of frequency and skill building in a way.
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. So the particular course that I taught was a seminar style, very small number of students, 5 or 6, and we met once a week for 2 hours. And so every week, students would engage with 1 or 2 different texts. And so I'm happy to share the syllabus with you, and it has links to the actual texts that I used. and so, and it was a quarter-long course, so we met 10 times. So there is this habit I was developing of, engaging with the text, and students were, and the other thing I did too was at the end of the course, I actually had students, so early today, when I modeled this process with you, I had all of you read the text and then jump right into discussion. What I actually did in the class that I taught was the students engaged with the text on their own outside of class, and then they wrote a reflection or like a response, a short response paper, or actually they could record too if they didn't want to actually write out a paper. But and then they came into class and then they shared their responses. And so at the end of the quarter, I actually invited students to reread their responses and sort of foster that kind of meta reflection, like reflection on reflection, and see in what ways, if at all, their own thinking on certain topics have shifted or changed. But so I think the frequency will depend in part on, what courses you're teaching. I, again, taught a course that met once a week for 2 hours. And so the frequency was 1 or 2 texts a week. And again, I'm happy to share the syllabus with you.
Oh, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I like that idea at the end of getting them to go back and then, think about how their thinking changed. And were these predominantly, like, what were the academic or disciplinary backgrounds of these students?
They came from a variety. There were a couple of students from sustainable food systems, and this was at UC Davis. And there were economics, human development, education, what else? Women's studies. So it's kind of all over, mostly social sciences, but yeah. And the year, I had a couple of freshmen and sophomore, junior, senior, so it's a wide range as well. Yeah.
That was my next question. Was that's a wide range, and so
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I like how the text seems pretty accessible.
Exactly, yeah. So it really does not require any particular theoretical concepts or anything. It's very accessible, and that was by design as well. Yeah.
But then students' ability to engage with it, I mean, the topics are accessible, but the way in which you want them to engage, did you find that, what were your strategies to, I guess that was the frequency and the coaching was part of the strategy to get them all towards a generative ability to communicate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I shared with you the sample discussion questions. So those, I did include those questions in the syllabus too, because I mean, if you just say, just reflect or respond to the text, and you may not get much. But if you say, here's a menu of prompts that you can respond to, that can it's a scaffold basically to guide students in responding to a given text. And that's especially helpful for younger students. But I provide that scaffold for all students so that it's there. And of course, students can respond however they want. But if they're feeling stuck or they're not sure how to respond, then they can, what's a phrase that stood out to you, that could be the start of a, response. That could be interesting. So, yeah.
And then my one last question, I promise. Yeah. A rubric? Did you have a rubric that you used to, because I can imagine, and when we do our reflection, students like, you're going to grade my reflection?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. Would you share that with us if that's okay? Or
this was not a great, so it's like pass or fail at this course actually. And so with reflections and with basically everything they submitted, I did not have a rubric. So it wasn't like I was trying to, for each student, did this person, demonstrate critical food literacy in these ways? Like I didn't have a full-on rubric like that. I was, you know, in a way, I was just like piloting this course, and rather than trying to evaluate the students, I was really trying to understand how the students were engaging with the text and and that made it more open. I could keep a more open-minded mind about it, because if I were trying to evaluate, then it would be it would not be research so much. I was really trying to explore how different students engaged with their with the various texts, and not ascribe, oh, that was a good response versus that was a bad response. And so when I was reading or listening to the students' responses, I responded as well, but more like, not like, oh, that's great, but it's like, oh, so what do you mean by this part? Or, you know, like, here are some questions for you to consider. So that was more my level of response, rather than like, you should, you know, it was less prescriptive and more just, and that was the nature of this particular course. It was pass fail. It was meant to be exploratory. So it would be interesting to consider, like, what would a rubric look like? And I think that would be something worthy of doing. But that's not something I did for this particular course. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any other reflections they wanted to share or questions? I see a comment from Dr. Sterling. Makes me want to be a student in your class.
Thank you.
If no one else has a question, I got one.
Sure, please.
I guess I'm just thinking about when I was a TA and coming from my counseling psychology background, like something I thought about a lot was like, how do I, you know, support discussion for students while they're, you know, feeling into new ways of discussing things, as you're talking about, trying to get them into it, right? But like, what's the role of my like authenticity in facilitating that, like coming from a counseling background, because like we think about that. But obviously there's a tension between like making students comfortable by showing your part of your reactions to things so they know where you're at. And there's a tension between that and like, obviously, you know, not bowling them over with your authority and perspective. And I just connected to what you were saying most recently there about like something about the emotional work or the emotional aspect, the affective aspect of that. Will's been getting me to think about this, the affective aspects of the pedagogy. And like, do you have any thoughts on like, yeah, that? Like, what is the type of affective decisions you're making when you're thinking about your own reactions?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a difficult one too. I think, well, so first of all, I think as I mentioned before, like when I was first setting out to teach this class and design this class, I didn't think that I would be so emotionally affected by it. And so I think it's important to recognize that sort of the affect is really important to consider. So that's the first thing. And then also, like, what I did was after each class that I taught, after each session, I set aside time to reflect and like unpack what happened. And I needed that both personally, because sometimes the discussions really left me exhausted, and also like gave me a chance to like breathe and again reflect on what happened. And then and this is actually something that feminist scholars have always done in feminist pedagogy. So I found myself turning to you know, like bell hooks and other feminist scholars and their work as I was you know, teaching and reflecting. And they're, you know, they've always been kind of embracing the affect and not saying like that makes it less rigorous or something. Like I think, and especially for, you know, teaching students about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and values-based, there's going to be, it's emotion laden. And so we, as instructors, need to take the time to unpack the emotions that do come up. And I think it's helpful to do it both like individually, but also with somebody else that you trust. And so that's the critical friend piece. And to be able to really honestly talk about, because emotions are difficult to talk about, but if you have a trusted colleague that you can kind of share your whatever you're feeling openly and then work through it, it's really, I think, critical.
Can I jump in quickly for that?
Yeah.
So Lina, to kind of put you on the spot, but not, we won't hold you to this, but like the idea that you brought up now, what, if someone, so here's the question, is the role of the instructor to be stoic and objective, or is the role of the instructor to be a part of the affective circulation?
That's a good question. So you mean like in the classroom, like in the moment as you're actually teaching the students? Is that what you mean? Like,
because like you said, like through the discussions you would start like being impacted, and now going back into these settings, knowing that will happen, and in some ways, if it didn't happen, maybe you're not like oh, I didn't pick a good enough text. But so knowing that it will happen, the next time, will you be stone-faced, or in, and the in is a spectrum. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a great question, and I think that so when I was teaching, I think that I did not okay, so I mentioned that, when certain students said things, like my heart rate was going up and I could feel my face going red, but I did try to keep it, quote unquote professional. So not like stone faced, but, kind of also not showing shock or anything like that. Because as an instructor, and this is more me as a person, I don't want to like alienate any students like in the moment. But what I ended up doing though was after the class, like I actually did have a one-on-one with a couple of the students, not just to check in also. And there I was more open, and not saying that like, again, I think there's a varying perspectives on this too, but I think as an instructor, I lean more toward not necessarily disclosing my own perspectives. Of course, like in teaching the course and in selecting the text, I'm already demonstrating the particular values I'm bringing in. But whenever I'm, engaging with students in the group as a class or one-on-one, I really do try to like empathize and really value the perspectives and experiences that they're bringing in, and not denying that outright. And so my role is to kind of just provide multiple avenues through text in this case, to just kind of gently nudge them, or like kind of inviting them to entertain different perspectives, but not forcing it, and and I think that's a clear distinction that I have in my head between an instructor and an advocate or an activist. I think, and again, there's probably debates or different perspectives on this too, but I think that I personally think that instructors are not in the business of telling students like this is how to think about something. It's really the role of the instructor is to provide a whole wide variety of experiences and texts, and let students grapple with the perspectives, but ultimately like leave it to them to like we can't force the particular shift in their thinking or yeah, their attitude. So yeah, does that answer your question? I'm
Yeah,
not trying to
absolutely.
dodge it or anything.
No. It was like it was kind of a horrible question to ask, but at the same time, I'm curious. Not like, again, not holding you to any just because
Yeah.
it seems it is. I think it's increasingly from my practice recognizing how that. Yeah, I haven't done enough time thinking about which of me shows up in these moments. Like, knowing that I want to like target affect, or that
Right.
affect is always there, and but then right, and I agree, like the professional versus the activist or the advocate, there's something in there. I think you brought this up, but I should jump back into the feminist literature, because they've been doing this intentionally for a long time.
Yeah.
And so they probably have a lot to teach us about that.
Yeah. And I think this sort of community of practice that this webinar series is trying to foster, I think that's also, this is a great space also to unpack, because I think, yeah, there's just, I think, varying perspectives on the role of the instructor. And I think it's, I think oftentimes, especially in COVID times, like I think many instructors may have to work in isolation with one another, but this type of webinar and this type of community practice can be helpful. And even if you don't come to a resolution, I think that having this kind of discussion is illuminating in itself.
Mm-hmm. So thanks for entertaining that question. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina. That was amazing. And I'm so grateful for you for sharing all of your experiences and expertise and answering all of those uncomfortable, some of them are uncomfortable questions, but I think that was really insightful. If any of you have questions for Dr. Yamashita, her email address is there, and we hope we can continue to engage with you through this community of practice in this webinar series. To Dr. Yamashita and the rest of you, our next webinar is in 2 weeks, also at I think the same time. And if you have other recommendations for speakers for next semester, please share with us. And I'm going to pass it on to Bill. He has a recommendation for a film, and looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks so much, Lina. And yeah, I just put in a little clip that while we were talking and talking about different like short to the point and like bringing up affect in this is a short little film that we use. It's free, it's online, and we use it in terms of getting our students to think about hunger in the K-12 setting, or K-7 really. So I just wanted to share that, and then if others have other short texts or videos that they use that are open access, it would be lovely to kind of curate and archive these so that we can. Yeah, it's always nice to know when someone else has kind of vetted some material and they're like, yes, this will work, and watch out. Thanks so much again, Lina, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lina, for organizing. So.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lina. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Thank you so much, Lina. I will be in touch sort of with follow-ups, and it will be great on our website. We post a lot of the material that you recommended. So I know you posted recommended a bunch of platforms. So we'll post those as well as some of the other resources that you mentioned. Yeah, and it'll be great to continue to engage with you in this webinar. And your sort of education background, I think, was very apparent. A lot of us teaching sustainable food systems don't have that educational background, and we have an education grant right now, and interacting with educators who have their background in education, it becomes very apparent. So thank you for bringing that.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for the invitation. I really enjoyed this. Okay, bye.
Bye all.